All right. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. Again, my name is Drew Williams. I'm the marketing manager for Kobiton. Today's webinar is titled Are Testers the New Product Managers? And we'll be looking at the future of QA's role in the SDLC. That said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists for the day. We've got Joel Montbileski, who is the Chief Solution Architect at Practitest. We're also joined by Frank Moyer, the Chief Technology Officer at Kobiton. And lastly, our moderator for today is Nilesh Patel, who is the Director of Testing at KMS Technology. Each panelist will have exactly 2 minutes to answer each question, and we prefer and appreciate if all audience questions are reserved for the end, at which time we will answer them.
The first question is, the job description, quote unquote, the job description of the testers appears to be changing. With the adoption of Agile and now DevOps, everyone is talking about the quality and testing being the responsibility of the whole team. Where does this leave the tester, and what is his or her role? Joel, you're up first.
Thanks, Nilesh. Well, to put it clear, the way that I see it, it doesn't really changes the actual work that we have, but it does. It changes the work. It doesn't change the responsibility. We are still in charge of quality. We're still in charge of testing, but we're not going to be doing all of it because larger and larger parts of them are going to be done by other people, namely developers. What this is actually doing to testers is that it is allowing us to focus more on other stuff that we didn't really have time to do up to now. I remember when I started testing, I don't know, over 20 years ago, it was very frustrating to be called a QA engineer, but you were stuck doing testing all the time. You couldn't focus on the real quality aspects, like processes, like metrics, stuff like that. And I do believe that because we have other people taking upon responsibilities in testing, then we can start focusing on other stuff, again, namely metrics, processes, our work with developers. And it's basically refreshing because we can do more of that cool stuff that always was, again, important but not urgent, and so we couldn't actually get to.
Thanks, Joel. Frank, your thoughts?
Yeah, no. So Joel, I think hit a few key points here, and what's happened over the past 10 to 15 years is that the tooling has made it easier to for the testers to do their job and given more time to the testers to do other tasks. I oversee a team of 10 developers working on a mobile app. We brought on a test lead about 3 months ago. And their role is not just testing the application. Their role is also owning the product features that come into the product. So although I still set the product vision for the product, the tester is the one who actually owns the feature requests when we break down that vision, or when customer requests come in and they want to add new features. So that role of the tester is both on the front end of new features coming in, and also verifying, that those were implemented correctly. And in many ways, the tester knows better than anybody in the organization how a product should function and how it does function.
Great, those are interesting points. And this one, Frank, you'll start off first. So there are these terms, maybe even cliches, shifting right and shifting left. Behind all these cliches, there's a kernel of truth. What does it mean in layman terms to shift right or left, and how can this benefit the testers?
And it goes back to this question goes back to my previous comment about tooling. I think a lot's happened over the past 10 to 15 years that allows the developers to do more with automation, and an imperative to shifting left, or in many ways shifting right, is to have automation in place. That automation is in test automation, but it's also in the workflow automation of deploying code, running checks against the code. An extreme example of that is GitHub. Their developers are checking their code in. It goes through a set of automated scripts and gets immediately deployed to production. They have automated monitoring that if anything is an anomaly, it automatically gets backed out. So this is that's an extreme case of where the automation, both in terms of deployment and in terms of testing is in place to enable that agility for GitHub to add features to their product. And at Kobiton, we are enabling that through automation, allowing we're coming out with a product over the next month that will allow the tester to execute a manual test on one device and then rerun that test in future regressions, but also rerun that test against a multitude of other devices without any scripting capability. That's, we're doing that in service of continuous automation.
Great. Joel, your thoughts?
Yeah, Nilesh, and I'm gonna stick to the point where you said that it's a cliche, and I think that it's a cliche because people repeat it without really understanding where it's coming. And so instead, what I usually do when I talk to people is that, and they say, hey, are you shifting left or are you shifting right? I try to explain that I don't see it as shifting left or right. Imagine that you have basically a balloon and you're inflating it. So you're expanding the area of that balloon, and that is what's happening to testing. And it's basically, again, it can be even linked to the question that we had before. So imagine that, again, you have a little bit more time and you're able to do more stuff. So when you start the sprint as a tester, as a quality assurance engineer, you will be able to work more on the user stories. You will be able to add more meat to it, to validate it better, to make sure that you're not basically fighting with other user stories or conflicting with other user stories that you had. So that might be the equivalent of shifting left. You're going earlier in the business. But here's the cool part. You're also automatically shifting right because you're putting a lot of more efforts into what's happening after you deployed it. One of the things that I think it's coolest about what's happening lately, mostly on DevOps operations, is that we're putting a lot of more efforts. Testers are putting a lot more efforts on the monitoring side of the house. So we're not only monitoring to make sure that, for example, we have less exceptions when we release it. And again, as Frank was saying, yes, if there are exceptions, we can roll back. But we're putting even monitors to make sure that if we released a feature, if we expected users to work on a feature, then we will be able to see if those testers are working on that feature. So part of expanding right basically will mean that we're focusing on quality on a live basis, even after the product has been released to the field. And that's actually pretty cool because it means that we can apply quality observations to a broader area of the system.
Yep, that makes total sense. I mean, I think, just to jump in a little bit, I think because they shift left and shift right, those terms and those methodologies are not going anywhere anytime soon. So those are great points by both of you guys. And this one's for you, Frank. You'll be up first. Why are testers qualified to serve as product owners or product managers? Why not developers or anyone else in the team more suited for this role?
Yeah, and I sort of covered some of this on the response to my last question. The tester knows how the product actually behaves. It's not what it was, not the original design. It's actually how it functions across different facets. So they're the ones who are looking at the application from a usability perspective, from a performance perspective, whether it crashes or if it's a mobile app or it doesn't. They know the ins and outs of the application, or the web app. They have a great breadth of knowledge. The developers focus typically on a specific area and get really deep. The tester is typically getting much broader in functionality, and they know they're able to guide feedback either if there is a separate product manager or actually take on that position as product manager because they know it so well.
Okay, great. Joel, you're up. Yep.
Well, there are quite a lot of things when I was thinking about this question, and again, Frank took quite a lot of it, what I was thinking, and the fact that yes, as Frank was saying, I always explain it that a developer will take a complex feature and will break it down to very, very small functions that he will then develop. So he's going inside of it. A tester will look into a simple feature and will try to think of all the different ways that it can actually go more complex when it actually cross-references other parts of the system. So that is like the system view versus the specific view. But I think that other than that, one of those characteristics that make a good tester turns him or her into a great tester is empathy. if you're able to, even if the user has never used such a feature or feature like it, if you're able to get into the shoes of that user and understand the way they think and understand the way they might potentially work with the system, then that actually makes people a great tester instead of only a good tester. And that is what I think that makes a tester a better candidate for being a product manager, because it's not only about understanding, it's about sometimes even feeling the users, and you see that on great testers. Now, having said that, and again, my experience has taught me that testers can be great product managers. I've also seen developers being great product managers, but it is a little bit less common, I need to say. So I think that other than the fact that our brains we are actually taught to think like users, we can also empathize with them a little bit better.
Yeah, those are great points. I agree there too, as well with you guys. And this one is going to Frank. If I'm a tester and I find myself taking the role of a product owner or manager, what should I do differently in order to succeed in this role?
Yeah, great. First, I love Joel's response to the previous question. You know, the empathy perspective is really interesting and a different way to look at the tester's role, and I think it's something that testers should really take that to heart when they do their job, when they show up to work every morning. That their job is that role of being, you know, an empathetic user of the product. But moving on to the question, the answer to the question, you know, I would recommend document test cases and with the user stories. Like the test case is the other side of the user story. So step up in the organization and document. That documentation is going to go a long way in helping the rest of the organization understand how the product should behave. And then, you know, there are systems out there that help document user stories and product features. So start to work with your product manager, or if you don't have a product manager and there's nobody in that role, then start to leverage products like Jira, or there are some product-specific tools like Product Board, where you can actually document features and work with the organization to have a system that tracks the feature requests together with the user stories and the test cases all together. So, you know, documentation is a key part to stepping up within the organization.
Great. So I just one follow-up to that, Frank. Where do you think testers should kind of piggy bank or pair up with product owners or business analysts on that part as well too, to kind of succeed in their role?
I think so, right? So it depends on the organization, you know, right? All of this depends, right? It depends on the size of the organization. If you have a product analyst, product manager, and you're a test manager, then pairing up and actually writing the test cases in parallel to the user stories is a very helpful exercise, right? Because you're getting the understanding of how the product should behave directly from the people who are designing the features. And there is no miscommunication. And the testers are going to provide valuable input because they know how the product actually works. Right? Typically, the product manager or the analyst may know how it's designed to work, but the tester brings this version of how it's actually behaving. The functionality that as the developers as they've actually implemented it, which the product analyst may not know.
Great, Joel. Same to you.
Okay, I'm going to take a little bit more to the original question. What should a tester turned product manager do to improve their chance of success? And funny story is that I was actually talking to a colleague in the office this morning, and my chief, even though I hate titles, they get in the way of work. My title in practice right now is Chief Solution Architect. So I mostly work on the side of defining the system and again, being kind of a high-level product architect of the product. But because when we started practice, I was the most senior person with testing experience. For a long time, I was both the product architect as well as the QA manager. So One of the guys, the company says are going to be talking about based on your experience, and that's when it's landed that actually I can. And this question in particular, I think that it's very challenging when you're quote unquote turned into a product manager from being in a testing role, and especially if you need to do both roles, because if you need to do both roles, you need to understand that you're going to be wearing two very different hats for your organization. The testing hat is a hat where you will be focusing on reviewing and finding all the bad things, or you're going to be focusing on yeah, all the issues that might arise, stuff like that. Where when you're working from the product manager perspective, you're working based on let's generate the best feature for the business and for the users and stuff like that. So there might be conflicts of interest sometimes, and it needs to be very clear what hat are you going to be wearing at each one of those points. And it gets complicated sometimes when people basically call out on you and say, hey, but 2 days ago you said completely the opposite, and then you say, hey, yeah, but 2 days ago I was the QA manager, today I'm actually the product manager, and it's a little bit confusing. I also think that even though people think that testers need to have thick skins because you get, again, rejected many times, product managers need to have thicker skin, because it's not only being push shoveled and knifed around by your development team. You're also going to start being push shoveled and knifed around by your support team, your sales team, direct customers, your CEO, and everyone else. So understand that if you thought that you were like between a rock and a hard place before, it only got a little bit worse right now. Still, it's a fun job. I wouldn't change it for the world, but it's very different from what we did before as testers.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely a different mindset that you have to shift to. And this one's for you. I believe it's for you, Joel. You're up first on this one. 1 second. If a tester is no longer just about finding bugs, then how do we define quality assurance? What is the QA in a modern organization, and how is it evolving?
That's a great question, and I'm going to actually go for my source of inspiration here. And if you're not aware, there's a couple of guys, Alan Page and Brent Jensen, they have the A/B testing podcast, and they have been expanded on a concept they call modern testing lately. And they basically said that, and again, it's a little bit quote unquote futuristic for many organizations, but I think that there's a kernel of truth in here. And they say that the job of the tester is to accelerate the achievement of shippable quality, meaning everyone is doing testing right now. So what we need to do is basically to help the business achieve that faster. And that basically means for me it's focusing on the quality with a capital Q, looking at all aspects of quality within the organization. If it's going to be, hey, let's make sure that we can test less by monitoring better, and let's make sure that we're going to be in charge not only of deployments, but that we have a pretty good and sturdy rollback system in case something was to happen, or that we can start having better means of moving towards production. So all of those aspects of quality, I think that is the added value that we can provide. And again, I'm not making this up. These guys actually came up with this, and I think that it's genius. But it is understanding that we can actually start focusing on the capital Q of quality throughout the whole organization, and not on the not simple, but smaller piece that it's testing within that complete quality picture.
Great, thanks. Frank, you're up.
Yeah, sure, Nilesh. So, I think before I answer the question, I want to touch on the success of the organization. It's this balance of speed to market and quality. And while I think QA in modern organizations are becoming more balanced in terms of the speed to market aspect and the level of quality, and having the automation and the reporting in place to make good business decisions on whether a product is ready to ship. But on the actual, how do we measure or how do we define quality assurance? For mobile, it's easier. I think it's easier than web, because the tester can look at the mobile app ratings and see how the users are actually feeding back on the product. That's a great measurement for just how good is the usability, how good is how often does it crash? All those components play into the quality of the product. So I think in mobile, they say beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. In testing, quality is in the eyes of the user.
This one's for you, Frank. You're up first. How can QA influence development to write testable code? For example, stable element IDs for automation scripts and et cetera and so forth.
Yeah, and I'll dive into a lot of technical components here. So mocking is probably one of the most important things to add to, or mockability, add to code to make it testable. And it's probably the thing that's thought of last. An experienced tester or test architect will understand the importance of implementing mockable components, so that if you're calling a credit card service or credit card verification service, you don't actually have that call in place. And not only that it's mockable at the unit test level, but you have a built component whose role it is to, when you deploy the code into a test environment, that it can serve that function and have different states that are configurable. On the mobile side, as pointed out here in the actual, as you mentioned, Nilesh, is the element IDs. One of the biggest challenges in working with Appium is each manufacturer will render the element ID or the XPath differently. So it becomes increasingly difficult to just have one piece of source code for your script that can be used across all different device types. So being smarter about how you actually label your elements so that you can reference them by their element ID is important as well.
Great. Yeah, I can attest to that, man. It's having element IDs change all the time can be a pain in automation for sure. Joel, your thoughts?
Yeah, and again, I think that Frank went through all the technical aspects, and I'm going to go through a more pragmatic approach. In my experience, if you want to have your developers do more testable code, you need to make them suffer. And a very simple way is to tell them, hey, you know what, you're going to be in charge of testing. Automation in that charge. And even if they're not doing all the automation, let them do important part of them. Automatically, they will start adding good IDs into their code. You won't even need to do XPath anymore. They will start thinking smarter how to do it. Meaning, once you've walked a mile in someone else's shoes, then you start feeling their pains and you basically empathize with them a little bit more if we go back to empathy. So as much, two paths, either the CTO or the VP of R&D is going to say, hey, you're going to do it because I say so, or they're going to do it because they know that it's in their own best interest. So in my case, I strongly believe on having developers take part on those automation efforts, and automatically you will start seeing how the system becomes a little bit more testable one day at a time.
Perfect. Yeah, I think we all can agree using XPath can be a pain for automation testers.
By the way, it's a necessary evil. Sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes you will go with CSS as well because you don't have a choice.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
if you do have a choice, then make sure that you will have someone to exercise it for you.
Yep, those are great points. Should QA, and this one's for you, Joel, you're up first on this one. Should QA care about the business metrics? For example, App Store ratings, retention, and if so, how can they influence the outcome of that?
Oh, the answer is a simple, again, yes, as many times as you can. And yes on care, I'm not going to say about influence the outcome. I think that we can influence the outcome as part of a larger group as a company. I also believe in the saying that anything that is measured automatically goes up. But what I do believe strongly here is that we need to understand, and Frank, you said a little bit about it when you were mentioning about app stores and stuff like that, but I work on a web environment and it's even faster and simpler. Quality is not lack of exceptions. Quality, as you were saying, is in the eyes of the user. And for me, it's very simple. If I'm going to develop, I'm going to invest right now, I don't know, months of my development work on a feature. And after it's been released, I don't see that people are using that feature. regardless if it has bugs or not, then it's not the quality that I was looking for, because business-wise, people are not using that feature, and I invested quite a lot of time. And when you're working on a web application, if you have correct monitoring, it's very, very easy. And again, I have a number of examples. I'm not going to go into them, but one of the things that I really recommend is obviously have alerts for exceptions and all sorts of errors in the code, but your metrics should be focused on usage. And one of the things that you should do is, before you release a feature, make sure that you have instrumentation in there, and make sure that you have correct metrics in there, and that you will be able to see if the usage patterns and usage levels are either according or higher than what you expected. And if not, then do something about it. I strongly believe that as time will pass, monitoring and data science, data analytics will become a more and more important tool as part of the testers tool set. So it's a definite yes.
Awesome. Frank?
Yeah, and I agree with what Joel said. I think there's one thing that I would, I feel more strongly that the testers metrics should be aligned directly with App Store ratings in the mobile environment. I set up bonus compensation for my mobile testers based on the App Store ratings to make sure that that is their singular focus. They can, and their job is to represent the user through that rating. If there's an issue, they are looking at the poor ratings, and they're trying to, because they have variable compensation tied to that rating, they're trying to understand what the heck is going on. Why did we get a 2 stars for for our app yesterday? And they'll dig into the comment and understand what's going on. They'll work with customer support to respond. And they'll also work with developers and the product owner to make sure that the app is changed in response to the comments. So, I put that it's a lot easier in mobile, because we actually, in mobile, you have the App Store ratings as a guide, and it's easier to pin somebody's variable compensation to that specific metric.
Great, makes sense. All right, on to the next question. I think this one, Frank, you're up first for this one. Would you say that providing faster feedback on product is more important than finding bugs, issues?
Yeah, I'm going to work a little bit on semantics here, because I think, I would say reported bugs is one kind of feedback. And the faster feedback, it's one kind of, it's not the only piece of feedback. But again, I'm going to keep going back to mobile. As a organization that has a mobile app, you want to identify as many issues, any pieces of feedback as early as possible. So oftentimes we will implement a clickable prototype of our user experience so that we can find pieces of design feedback, design bugs earlier. And the most expensive place to find bugs, as we all know, is production after something is deployed. So you want to find every piece of feedback, whether that's a crash, which is just an obvious bug, or it's some user experience issue that may be more subtle. Those are all important pieces of feedback, and we all want to get the best product to market as fast as possible.
Great. Joel, your thoughts?
I think that, again, I'm going to go a little bit more into an agile DevOps kind of approach, and I worked for half my professional life in waterfall organizations where we had release cycles of 18 months, and so there was literally a wall between testing and development, and so you needed to report bugs. But again, it was a complicated matter. And when we switch over to Agile back in the day, for me, the most important and the best thing in the world was the fact that I could actually go to the developer while she was developing the code and give her feedback while she was working on it. Basically, we would make a stop and she would say, hey, go ahead and play with it a little bit. And just by playing, we would give her feedback on everything, starting from obviously bugs, it was magical. We could crash a system with only looking at it, but also feedback on usability. So I'm here with what Frank was saying, that yes, meaning bugs here is a type of feedback, and being able to provide that quickly, it's incredibly important. Being able to shorten the times. By the way, I'm one of those guys who says, hey, if you find the bug the developer is going to be fixing right away, don't even report it. Why? Meaning, I don't believe in politics, so don't go ahead and do it only for bureaucracy's sake. So that is the kind of loop that is magical. And I do believe that in this game, in today's age, where we're really forced to deliver continuously or daily or weekly or bi-weekly, speed is very important. So in that case, try to provide as much feedback as you can as quickly as possible.
Yep, great. And I think that's one more point I want to add to here is that I think when you guys talk about the whole product owners, testers becoming more product owners, product managers, the faster feedback is part of that, in my opinion. So just wanted to throw that up. When you give the feedback on the product, that's actually taking on the role of the product manager a little bit more seriously, putting on that hat a little bit more. And this one's for you, Joel, first. So where do you see test automation fit into this new shift of testers becoming product managers? How should product managers utilize test automation for their benefit?
I think that, again, these are two separate questions. The first one, how does automation allow me as a tester to be more of a product manager role? Simply because I can do less testing, or I can actually outsource part of my testing to developers who will do the automation, and it will help me reach stability a lot faster, and I don't need to do so many regression cycles manually. So that's going to be very, very useful. And that's like the first question. Me as a tester, I become a better product manager because I can actually become more of a product manager. I think that if I go to my second hat, as one of the roles that people don't realize about a product manager is, especially a product owner or product manager in an agile firm, is that sometimes we need to make a split-second decision on whether we're going to be releasing or not. Okay, wait a second. So we have our next window of opportunity in an hour, and if we want to go into production, we need to make the decision in the next 5 minutes. And having the ability of saying, hey, you know what, show me the results of the automation, the continuous testing that has been running now, it gives you that good feeling that you're not releasing, sorry for my French, but crappy software out there, because you do have that stability that comes from automation. So it basically helps on both sides of the role.
I go back to one of the best product managers that I've ever worked with. He was responsible for delivering a $14 million product that was the self-assessment tax filing for the UK government. 60 million users. It had to be done. It was a 9-month project. He had to lay out all the product features, the tax requirements, and what he did best. Dave was the same. What Dave did best was he got in and tested probably as much as all the testers did. There was very little difference between the product manager and the tester early on. But when it came to actually guaranteeing the quality, having automation in place and his input to driving the automation was imperative. We could not have achieved our goals had we not had that automation in place. And that's driven a lot of what we're building at Kobiton is the ability for a product manager to execute a user story, an exploratory test or user story on a single device, and then store that off as a memorized set of steps that can be replayed in the future or replayed against any other device type. Device coverage in mobile is crucial, and testing on an iPhone 6 may only give you 5% of the market without having to hire an automation engineer, without having to write a script. That 6% can turn to 100% without any additional effort.
Great, that sounds awesome, actually. So that could solve a big problem. And this one's for you, Frank. If testers are becoming more product owners, should testers continue to expand on their technical skills? Where do you see non-functional testing like performance testing fit into this role?
Yeah, so when you say no to one thing, you say yes to something else, and we all have limited time in the day. it's beneficial to work on technical skills. I think there's a sort of a line there that you don't, you know, coding up the application is an extreme that you don't want to put your tester through. That's not their job. And I think focusing more on the product features and some of the things I mentioned earlier about documenting product requirements, having a system of record that you can use to reference back in history what each version of the product did is a more valuable use of a product owner or a tester's time. And I think the non-functional facet of an application is crucial. With what Kobiton will be releasing to the market will allow the product owner and the tester to create this system of record for the application. We capture the video, we capture log files, we capture the defects through integration with Jira, and we capture screenshots. So you'll see a full view of the application, but we'll also capture the non-functional components. What was the CPU footprint on a Samsung S8 during this text execution? What was the response time for this step when I executed the login step? What was that response time, and has that changed over time? So all of this becomes the system of record that can be referred back to for both product managers and testers to make sure that when a new release comes out, that the behavior hasn't changed in an undesirable way.
Great, thanks, Frank. And Joel, your insights on this?
Yeah, here I'm not sure that I will agree. I agree on part of what Frank was saying, but I still have another view on this. And one of the things that I have been saying is that software development and most of the stuff that we do around development firms is a technical job. And so if you're going to be a tester in a technical company, the more technical you are, without going to extremes, obviously, the better suited you will be. And in this case, I remember a product manager who had a background in development, and obviously that helped him. But one of the cool things was that when we were actually sitting together and we were going over log files, he was able to parse over them very quickly because he did have that basic technical knowledge. Or if he wanted to do something for us and tell us specifically about a bug that he saw at a customer side, he didn't have a problem actually going over the CSS code and trying to understand what the problem was. And again, those were not requirements for her in that case, but it was a very good added value for that. So I do believe that as much as you can allow yourself, try to continue to be technical without going to extremes. You need to focus on the stuff that you need to be doing, but I think that it will help not only during that communication. I mean, if I'm talking to a product manager and that person doesn't really understand how AWS works when you're going to deploy something, it's a bigger challenge, but also meaning having those tools to do a faster, better job by yourself, it's also going to come handy. So I think that we need to have, every person need to have like limits where I'm going or where am I going. But as a tester, even if I'm not a tester right now, even I'm working as a product manager, I make sure to always be up to speed. And if my team is actually starting to work in closure script technologies, go ahead and play with that a little bit. Try to understand what's going on in there. And if we're working with a new database, go ahead and play with that. Try to understand what's going on behind it. Not in a level that I can actually develop code for that, but at least that I would have a very cool understanding of the limitations and the capabilities. So I do recommend as much as you can.
I believe we have some time for some audience questions.
Yeah, awesome. So great feedback, both Joel and Frank. Definitely appreciate that. We do have a couple of great questions here. So I'll get started with the first one. And I'll let Joel go first and then Frank, and then we'll alternate with the next question. So first question, where does this whole idea of testers as product managers come from? Is it just a Kobiton thing? And I'm asking because even after having worked in different organizations as a tester at different levels, I find that even to this day and age, testing/testers are still considered as second-class citizens. So how does one go about it? Joel, would you like to start?
Yeah, and again, Sorry, I'm not a Kobiton guy. I have been accused of many things in my life, but not of that one yet. And it is something that we actually see, and I think that it starts more informally. And by the way, I think that the tester as a second class citizen, it's something that I used to see more and more. I see less and less right now, especially on agile teams where you have cross-functional teams working together, and people realize the hard part of being a tester and the value that they provide. But even when working on waterfall teams, when the tester was able to provide good feedback and he or she was able to actually give value to the team, then people started noticing that person. And so slowly but surely, they started consulting him more and more. And I remember even when I was working on another company, it doesn't matter the name, even though I was a test manager, my product management team asked me proactively to go to customers with them in order to understand the needs better. So yes, I was a test manager, but product management says, hey, you seem to grasp the reality better. So it took a while. It took me about 3 years to get into that point, but I was starting to go to customers all the time for that. Okay, so it is something that not every organizational culture will have. It's something that you will need to basically fight for, especially in waterfall teams. But as you go to more agile teams, then it's a little bit easier to do because it falls naturally into your place. First of all, you will be kind of a pseudo PO, product owner, and then you might even become part of the product management team there. So again, have faith and work on it. It's not gonna rain on you like out of the sky, but if you work on that, you might be able to get to that.
Yeah, I think Joel nailed it. The only thing I would add is start to position yourself within the organization as if it's not there's obviously the politics involved, but the test and product owner. You start to you can be that you can own that role. You know that product better than anybody else. So have the confidence that you're in that position and you know it.
Awesome. Okay, great answers, both of you. Moving on to the next one. What is the importance of having accurate acceptance criteria, and who is responsible for defining that acceptance criteria? Frank, we'll go ahead and start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think it's the thing we, besides not putting mocks in your code, it's the thing that we do least frequently and something that we should do more often. It's often an afterthought of, well, is this good enough? And there's a judgment call. At the end of the day, there's always a judgment call of whether a product has an acceptable level of quality. But that shouldn't be something that's done without some criteria defined up front. So I think it's crucial to have that, but to also allow for exceptions, because at the end of the day, you're trying to get the best possible product shipped earlier. Now, here is where I encourage testers to use formal escalation procedures within the organization to make sure the right level hears your voice in terms of quality. Especially, when I'm putting bonuses on the tester, I want that escalation. I want them to be the voice of the user to say, no, this is not going to go well. Our ratings are going to go down if we ship too early, if we don't satisfy our acceptance criteria. And I do think it's the job of the tester to make sure that, or the test manager to make sure that the acceptance criteria is clearly laid out and everyone agrees to it up front. It's a lot easier to get people's buy-in when it's laid out up front and you get the rest of the organization's agreement on the acceptance criteria and going back later and saying, okay, here's how we're doing against that, than to not have it in place and try to convince people that we shouldn't ship product because it's not meeting our quality standards. People are going to go, what quality standards?
Right. Good response. Joel, how about you?
I agree with Frank on a lot of those parts. I just want to point a couple of things. First of all, if you remember, user criteria or user acceptance basically comes from UAT, and that's user acceptance testing, or acceptance criteria is actually user acceptance testing. It should, if possible, comes from the user. And again, I remember back in the day, larger contracts, basically you had like a large document, formal signed document that this is the acceptance criteria, and if you pass it, then the customer will even pay you. If you don't, they won't pay you. And so who should define it? either the user or the proxy of the user in the organization, sometimes the product owner, sometimes the product manager. The question then becomes, how do you set it? And Frank, I do agree in a lot of the points that you said, but more pragmatically, there are some good practices to do. The first of them is basically benchmarking. You know that you cannot release something that is worse than what you have outside. So if you're talking about response time or again, the simple, can we take this feature out or can we replace it with another feature? Well, yes, if you have all the functionality in there, so that's part of the criteria. And going to what you were saying also, we need to go to our users. Then one of the things that I found very, very useful is historical data. Many times, for example, you might go back to your archives and say, hey, you know what, remember when we released this feature 3 years ago? And we actually got a lot of rejects from the field because A, B, and C. So these A, B, and C, if you can translate it into criteria of how it should behave or the functionality, even the colors or what should be supported, then it's very hard to fight with you on something that history has proven right. So try to look for that information as much as you can. Benchmarks and historical data, those are very good allies of yours if you can find them.
Drew, I'd like to just respond to that. I don't agree. I think it's, you know, if you have a product that's in production that's taking 100 milliseconds for a certain response, and you know, what you said was that you're not going to put something out there that's any worse than what it is today. So let's say it's 100 milliseconds today, and it's 150 milliseconds tomorrow. Are you not going to ship product because of that? No. You ship product based on, especially if it's in a not commonly used part of your system. And to the system colors, you know, if the system colors are slightly off, are you going to hold up product release for a day for something that is just a slight deviation from your quote unquote standard? No. I think it's, you know, there's a line here that there's it's not as clear cut as that. There's a lot of ambiguity, and it's critical to have that acceptance criteria defined up front, with and allowing escalation to work around that. So maybe, you know, the UI designer's like, hey, this is our brand. You know, we're Pepsi-Cola. We have to have that on brand. You know, that's valid. Color matters to them. If it's a small startup or something that isn't as focused on consumer brand, it's okay to have that deviation from their color strategy.
Frank, I think that it's obvious that there's going to be exceptions and that people are actually making those decisions, and those decisions are business decisions. And so obviously there's flexibility. But I have stood a lot of times in places where the developer comes and tells, hey, you know what, we're not going to fix this bug because it's not important. And if you go back and you say, hey, look into the history of that, we actually invested a lot of time in order to lower that response times to 100 milliseconds. If you, depending on where that place is, obviously, if it's something that it's seldom used, I will totally agree with you. But it's on one of your main screens, that might actually be something that you can use in order to help you define those criteria. Now, obviously, everything should be reviewed based on business decisions and importance. But the question is, if there's nothing, how do you actually come up with that? And again, going back to the guy who said, well, testers are second-class citizens. It's sad, but it's true in many places. And so when you try to fight for a bug, you might have a developer that only because that person is a developer coming and saying, hey, no, my opinion is bigger, is stronger than yours. So I'm sorry, I win and you lose. And so you need to have a little bit more of ammunition in order to pass along your points of view in there.
Yeah, I think the other part here is acceptance criteria. Maybe it's, you know, exit criteria for a stage of testing. You know, maybe it's while user acceptance testing agreed, you know, for a business type application, or if you've got a proxy product owner, that makes sense. But in a lower environment, you know, maybe it's integration testing or system testing that you would have some exit criteria to move to the next stage.
It's actually, you know what, it's exactly the point of who defines what an MVP is, a minimum viable product. does it need to include? And again, I'm going to agree with you. If it's a couple of pixels here and there, unless you're really, really a very big brand name, it shouldn't really matter. But I've had tons, as a tester, I said, not as a product manager, I had tons of discussions with my development on what should be the MVP. If what we're giving it's viable. And again, what happened was that for the developer, it was easier just to release that and move forwards because it suited them better. So as you said, we need to make sure that business is in there. And if there's no agreement, then the acceptance criteria should actually, the arbitrator should be business in there.
Agreed.
I think both of your comments go back to why testers are product owners, right? You guys are providing feedback and decision and information on how the product's going to be released or not released. I think both comments are actually tying into the topic perfectly well, actually. So as testers, we're providing that feedback. And then you're taking that.
This is all pre-scripted, that's why.
Okay, awesome. That was some good back and forth there. And speaking about UAT, the next question is, and we'll go with you to start, Joel. Which tester is more likely to have more application knowledge, an SIT tester or a UAT tester?
Oh God, what type of organization are you that you actually have that differentiation of testers? If I need to say, I think that the UAT will have more knowledge on how the system is used on the real world, because that guy's actually going to be getting feedback on whether he did a good job or a bad job based on how did he test based on the user. I think that the integration tester will have more technical knowledge on that part, because usually integration, you're basically finding those bugs where, no, this didn't connect well with the other, and you're going to very, very technical places. But if I need to choose, which I don't like to, I would go for the UAT testers.
What happens when the QA lead is focused on automation testing, but the team members, i.e. the rest of the team, want to do manual testing? Frank, we'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, that's a challenging situation. With every organization, there's a long-term objective and a short-term objective. And typically, while an application is maturing, there's resistance to putting automation in place because of the level of effort in maintaining changes to that ongoing, the rapidly changing application ends up not being worth the investment. So you want to wait first. Typically, in traditional software, you wait for a certain amount of time while the application is stabilizing in its functionality before putting automation in place. And now what you're saying is, well, we're at that point. Let's say the business is at that point where the product is mature enough for the QA lead to want to put automation in place. Then it makes sense to do in those areas. That doesn't mean that there is no longer there's no manual testing. Manual testing doesn't get done anymore. It's just that essentially checking, right? Automation is checking that something executed as expected, and the manual tester is doing a different role than automation. They're actually exploring the application, identifying issues beyond what the automation is checking.
Joel, did you want to add any thoughts to that really fast?
Yeah, very quick. And again, I think that Frank said it very nicely, that we need to understand there's a balance, and you will always need to have testers testing instead of checking, and automation will give you that stability and check. So I think that a lot of times we see people who are not technical enough or a little bit afraid of going into automation. And maybe it's a matter of asking, why don't you want to go into automation? Is it because the application is not stable enough, so let's wait? Or is it because you don't feel comfortable enough with automation, and then try to work on that side as well?
Awesome. Final question here, and I believe both of you know the answer, so whoever wants to quick draw and shoot first,
yes,
go ahead. All right.
42.
Well, both of you are wrong. Does Practitest currently have an integration with Kobiton?
I can actually go ahead and say it. We don't, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't. So I guess that we'll need to work on that, and that will be a kind of a to be continued. you can integrate between the two tools using, again, our APIs and a little bit of scripting. So it can be done, but
Yeah.
it's not a plug and play.
Well, again, thank you everyone for attending. I definitely want to thank our panelists, Joel, Frank, and Nilesh for moderating. All of you did a wonderful job. The recording of this webinar will be available on the Kobiton YouTube channel sometime early next week. With that said, thank you again, and we'll see you on the next one. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.